Hi, Erin McKenzie here, and today we're going to be talking about Lab 4. We're going to talk about the colony morphology along with growth patterns on Broths and Slants. So again, before we get started, we need to make sure that our lab bench is clean and that we are being as aseptic as possible. So even though we're not doing an actual experiment today, but rather just observing what we had grown up in the previous lab, we still need to make sure we're using aseptic technique. So that being said, I have my rubber band. So the first thing is I'm going to go ahead and pull my hair back, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead and clean off my lab bench. So to make sure that it's nice and clean, again, trying to implement as much aseptic technique as possible as if you were in the lab itself. Okay, so now that I have my lab bench cleaned and I've got my specimens out, I'm going to basically just kind of go through and we're going to be describing what we'd see on the plate. So if you were doing this in the actual lab setting, you would take your broth and your slant and your plate from the organisms that you grew up before in the aseptic transfer lab. And then really what you're doing is you're just looking at the colonies and trying to describe what the colonies actually look like growing on the plate and the broth and the slant. So using your lab manual, what you want to do is you want to be able to describe using the terms that are designated in the lab manual. So we're going to start off with the colony morphology, or the growth of the colony on the plate. So if you recall, when you're growing an organism on a plate, what you're trying to do is you're trying to streak for isolation, and that you'll have individual colonies of bacteria on the plate. So when we're describing the morphology of the organism, we're actually looking at the individual colony, which is going to appear as kind of a little circular dot on your plate if you did this correctly. Now, that being said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my whiteboard so I can show you the characteristics that I'm going to be looking at. So I want to be able to describe the shape of the organism, the margin, the elevation, the texture, and the pigment. And so I'm just going to do that using the descriptions that are in my lab manual. Now, in the case of the shape, okay, what we're looking for in the case of the shape is the organism can either be round, or it can be irregular, or it can be punctiform, meaning little tiny pin drop colonies. And so what I would do is I would just take a look at my plate, I would look and see what the individual colony looks like, and then I would just record what I think it looks like, okay? There's not really a right or wrong answer to this, so to speak. It's more of kind of a judgment call. So I'm going to say that this organism is going to be punctiform, meaning it's like little tiny pinpoint colonies. And so I would just write that down on my data sheet. Now, in describing the margin you're actually looking at the circular portion of the colony, so the outside edges of the colony. So in this case, my margin can be entire, meaning it's smooth with no irregularities, okay, meaning it's like perfectly round. It can be undulate or wavy, meaning it's kind of wavy around the outside, lobed, filamentous, or rhizoid. Rhizoid you only see when you're growing fungus on a plate. So if you're growing bacteria, you really don't want to see it branched out, okay? So in this case, if I was to look at the margin of my specimen, I'm going to go with it being entire, meaning it's completely round. Now, in looking at the elevation, for the elevation, I want to take a look at the organism from this angle, and then I want to see, is it raised up off the surface of the plate, or is it very flat? So in that case, it can be flat, it can be raised, it can be convex, and again, using the descriptions along with the images in your lab manual, you're just going to describe what the elevation looks like, okay? So on mine, I'm going to go with it being convex, meaning that it's not completely raised, but it kind of raises up and kind of curves over a little bit. So the next step would be for me to describe what the texture looks like, okay? Texture, of course, is going to be how it's growing on the plate. Is it going to be moist? Is it going to be mucoid in that it looks kind of like mucus? Or is it really dry, kind of crusty looking? So I'm going to go with, again, looking at the organism, I'm gonna say that it's pretty dry. So I'm gonna go with it being dry in this case. And then finally, the pigment production. Some bacteria will actually produce pigment such as Micrococcus luteus, which is yellow, Micrococcus roseus, which is kind of got a rose-colored appearance. Pseudomonas aeruginosa kind of has a bluish green color and smells kind of like corn chips, interestingly enough, and so forth. In most cases, bacteria tend to be white, so you don't necessarily have much pigment production in most cases. So in this case, I could just write down for pigment, I could just write down that it's white, and then I'm going to describe, is it opaque, meaning that I can't really see through it, or is it translucent, can I see through it, is it shiny, is it dull? Again, these are just characteristics that come straight out of your lab manual, and I'm going to say that it is white, and I'm going to say that it is opaque, okay, and that I cannot see through the culture. So, when I've finished observing what I see on my plate, basically, again, what I'm doing is I'm just going through and filling in these categories: shape, margin, elevation, texture, and pigment, describing what my culture looks like growing on a plate. So the next step would be to describe what does it look like on a slant and what does it look like on a broth. Now, these are not as detailed as what you see when we're talking about growth on a plate. So again, referring to my lab manual, okay, or the additional notes that were provided to you, I would go through and I would determine, okay, what does it look like growing on a plate? So I'm going to pull out my additional notes that I had provided. In the case of not a plate, a slant, pardon me. In the case of a slant, we can have either filiform, which is typically what you see in the case of most bacteria, meaning that it's going to be opaque, the edges are going to be smooth, and it tends to be somewhat moist. You may have what's called friable, which means it's kind of crusty looking or dry. You may have effuse, which means it's very flat, but it's like spreading. Rhizoid, again, you wouldn't see that unless you're probably growing fungus, because then it kind of branches out like tree branches. Or a cannulate, which means it's kind of spiny looking. So again, in taking your slant, okay, the growth patterns on the slant, of course, are not the same as a plate because you're not looking at individual colonies. So in looking at the slant, I'm really just looking at the streak on the slant, and then I'm describing using one of those descriptions as to what it looks like on the slant. So in this case, I'm going to say that mine is filiform on a slant, which tends to be what most bacteria look like growing on a slant. Okay, so then again, I would just fill in the category on growth in the slant. In my opinion, it looks filiform. Now, in the case of the broth, okay, broth patterns, again, these were provided in your additional notes, okay, you may have what's called a pellicle, which means it kind of forms a membrane at the top of the tube. You may have a sediment, which means it sinks to the bottom of the tube. Uniform fine turbidity means that you're going to have growth throughout, okay, meaning it looks kind of cloudy. Or flocculent would look like there's like pieces of stuff floating around in the media. So in the case of the broth, one of the things about a broth is it often can tell you about what type of conditions the bacteria prefers. If the bacteria is growing at the surface of the test tube and forms a pellicle, well, that would indicate that the organism is aerobic, meaning it prefers oxygen. If you have growth at the bottom of the tube, then that would indicate that the bacteria is probably anaerobic, meaning it doesn't really like to be around oxygen or cannot grow in the presence of oxygen. So again, I'm just going to kind of look at my broth, and then I would use one of these terms to describe what it looks like growing in a broth. In this case, mine sunk to the bottom of the tube, okay? So we would say that the growth in the broth is sediment, and that kind of indicates to me that it is probably anaerobic. So I'm just going to put anaerobic question mark out to the side, okay? So again, in this lab, really what we're doing is we are just going through, if you were doing this in the lab setting in the classroom, we would just be looking at the cultures that we grew on the plate and the slant and the broth, and then using our lab manual and our notes, we would just describe what the cultures look like growing on these types of media. So thank you for listening.